Federico, we are back with another episode of App Stories this week, sponsored by Fitbod and Impending. I'm, of course, John Voorhees, and today we are going to talk about one of our favorite topics of all time, I suppose, shortcuts.
Yeah, well, this is a fun one, right?
I'm excited for this episode.
It's the episode of the year where we get to share all of our thoughts and ideas for things we want to see, features that do not exist, but we figured, hey, it's the end of February, and Apple is already working on the next major version of iOS. It probably is already late for wish lists, but, we can still talk about those.
We can still wish and maybe hope some of these things end up on somebody's to-do list in Apple.
Maybe.
Who knows?
Maybe. I think that's how it works. You do a podcast and then Apple listens and they do the things you wanna see.
I'm pretty sure it works kind of magically that way.
It just happens automatically.
It does. But first, Federico, before we get to that, I want to see what's new with you, because I know you've been up to some things.
I'm still so I spent the past few days rethinking my approach to RSS and read later. And if you're curious, you can go read all about that in the latest issue of the Mac Stories weekly newsletter that we sent out to Club Mac Stories members on Friday. Bit of a few new things that I'm trying. I'm still in the process, though, of rethinking my home screen. I have, let's say, considered the idea of dropping widgets altogether from the first. Well, I think
from the first screen.
From the first screen. So
got it.
I've been thinking about this, and I think I'm reaching the point where what I wrote in October in my iOS 14 review is coming true. I think I'm bumping against the limitations of widgets in iOS 14, and I think I've reached a point where I'm missing the interactivity of those widgets. And I'm taking a look. It's very challenging for me to do this, but I'm taking a look at myself sort of from the outside to see how I'm using my iPhone. And what I'm seeing is that I dislike widgets that every time that I tap them, they open something. And that's just the nature of widgets in iOS 14. Every time you tap on a widget, it launches you into the app, with the exception of the Shortcuts widget, which is the only one that supports compact UI and interactions on the home screen. And in fact, the Shortcuts widget is the only one that I'm using on the home screen on a regular basis, and I'm really happy with it. But I'm disliking the lack of interactivity for every other widget. And at the same time, I'm not really finding any, if at all, benefit in the glanceability of widgets. And I think I'm accepting the reality that I'm not really a glanceable type of person. Like this idea of glancing at data, I don't really need it. I'm still in the mindset of when I need to look at something, it's easier and faster and better usually to just open the app and look at the full interface for it. Like, do I want to glance at a Fantastical widget when I can just open Fantastical and have a bigger calendar and it's equally fast? So I'm trying to consider, what does this all mean? Where it's this thought leading me toward? And I think I'm reaching the place where I'm going to have widgets on the Today page. Because, for example, the timey shortcuts, those are super handy to have. I'm going to have some widgets on the second, maybe the third page. But maybe on the first one, I just need to have like a shortcuts widget and the rest go back to icons. Because that's what I'm still using my phone that way most of the time. And I think what I realized is maybe what I knew all along, which is, man, I really would like to use interactive widgets with commands that I can execute from the widgets from the home screen itself.
Sure, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I still enjoy certain glanceable widgets, but I know exactly where you're coming from. I mean, for me, things like the weather, Carrot Weather, and the Photos widget, I like those a lot, and the calendar really. Both the the built-in Apple one and the time page one I find useful, because a lot of times I don't need to see more than the next 2 or 3 upcoming events. But there aren't a whole lot of other ones that and I guess headlines is another one I sometimes look at, because I have, I'm using that headlines app that we've talked about before for certain feeds. But beyond those, I'm not using the other ones very heavily anymore. So it's probably time for me to rethink it too, because I've started to feel the constraint of not having as many apps on my first home screen, especially when it comes to things like, I've always had like Test Flight and the App Store on my home screen, because we just spend so much time in those apps when we're researching new ones. And I'm starting to find it annoying to kind of go over to the second page and find those apps, because they really are both apps that I use every single day. So I may need to free up a little space myself. In terms of what I've been up to, a couple of things I'll just mention really briefly. I want to make sure we have time for a full discussion of shortcuts. But I signed up for a personal Hey account, a Hey email account, because I've really been enjoying our experiment. And one of the things I've been doing up until I signed up for this account, is that I was forwarding all my other email accounts into the Mac Stories email account, which worked really well. I would say the one downside of signing up for the personal Hey account, and then sending my personal email there, is that I have to retrain with the screener all that personal email all over again, because they're being forwarded into a new account. But it's not too bad to do that. And I just decided that first of all, I wanted to see what their unified inbox and linking of the two accounts is like. And I thought that there are not a lot of occasions, but there are some occasions where people are emailing me to like my Gmail or my iCloud account or something like that. And I want to just be able to respond to them from those accounts, or using this new Hey email account, which I think I may kind of tend to migrate to a little bit going forward, at least in communications with real people, which, as I think you've talked about before, is pretty limited these days, at least from a personal standpoint. I mean, we do that with work all the time, but from a personal standpoint, I don't email humans that often. It's usually I'm getting offers from companies and things like that. So I'm just experimenting with keeping those two things separate again, and so far so good. The other thing, which is relevant to last week, and when I talked a little bit about how I was trying to extend both home automations and personal automations through shortcuts, and I think this is relevant to our discussion today, is that for Club Mac Stories, I did a pretty interesting automation setup that allows me to eject an external drive that's connected to my MacBook Air using a HomeKit-enabled button. And it's kind of a convoluted scheme that involves a Mac menu bar app and some Apple script and the Shortcuts app, but it all works, and it works really well. And I've been pretty happy with it. I was frustrated with the fact that if you just pull a cable out of a Mac, you get the warning about ejecting your drives properly or improperly in that situation, compared to an iPad where you can just detach external storage and you're totally fine. And I wanted to come up with a solution that was approaching as simple as the iPad, but really nothing can be as simple as just yanking the cable out when you have to actually do something. But this button is a pretty good approach, I think. It's been working pretty well for me for the last several days.
Yeah, that was a great story. I really enjoyed it. So if anyone's curious, go check it out in the latest issue of Mac Stories Weekly for Club Mac Stories members. That's definitely an interesting rabbit hole that John went down into.
I was up really late one night dealing with that, because I wasn't satisfied with it until I got the last little bit of Apple script and everything figured out. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Fitbod. Fitbod is the fitness app that provides a personalized exercise plan, a fitness plan that actually fits you. When it comes to fitness, Fitbod believes that everyone can be better. Whether you're working out 3 days a week or twice a day, Fitbod's algorithm uses data and analytics to help you build on your previous workout, so that your next workout is scientifically proven to be better than the last. Fitbod has been fine-tuned by certified personal trainers to bring the best practices of strength training to you. Your workout program is tailored exactly to your needs, making it perfectly suited for your unique body, experience, environment, and your goals. It can be hard to know exactly how much you should be doing while exercising, but Fitbod figures all of that out for you so you don't have to worry about over or under training. Fitbod will also mix up muscle groups, exercises, sets, reps, and weights over time to keep you in top form. You don't need to spend hours researching the best exercises or workout strategies either. Fitbod does all of that for you. If you're working out at home right now, Fitbod also has a bunch of body weight only exercises. These are great for both indoors and outdoors. But if you're back at the gym, they have great exercises that work there too. They have everything you need, no matter how much equipment you have. I love that Fitbod is available to me wherever I go and with whatever equipment I have. This is something that's been super useful over the past year as my access to equipment has really varied. Whether I have access to a gym or just some weights or even resistance bands at home, Fitbod is there to give me the recommendations and workouts that I want. What I like most about Fitbod is that it carefully tailors your workouts to your experience, goals, and equipment. With just a handful of upfront onboarding questions, you're up and running with a program designed to meet your needs. It's super easy, and the workouts it generates are challenging without being too difficult. On top of that, there are great videos to guide you and a terrific Apple Watch app. Fitbod is available on iOS and Android, and you can get started right now by going to fitbod.me/appstories, where you'll also get a 25% discount on a new membership. That's fitbod.me/appstories to try Fitbod for free and get 25% off your Fitbod membership. Our thanks to Fitbod for their support of the show. Let's move on and talk more automation and talk about shortcuts, because we have quite a lot to talk about today. We're both, heavy users of shortcuts. It's integral to Mac stories and the way we get our work done. But there are a lot of things we'd love to see extended here.
Yes, we use shortcuts a lot. We have a lot of wishes, so we're going to move through them quickly because it's a long list of things we would like to see. And realistically, we're not going to get all of this year, right?
Right.
Maybe we're not going to get anything this year. Who knows? But it's still good to share and explain why we would like to see certain features. We organized our wishes in 3 main sections. So let's start from the app itself, the Shortcuts app itself. There's a few things that I personally would love to see when it comes to the editor itself, the Shortcuts editor, the UI that you see when you're putting together shortcuts. I mentioned this before. I'm going to rehash what I already wrote on Mac Stories in the past. I would love to be able to fold sections of a shortcut.
Yes.
For easier navigation. Especially when I'm putting together longer shortcuts like MusicBot, for example. It would be super convenient to be able to fold blocks like repeat blocks, or if, those conditional blocks that have if otherwise and contain actions within them, it would be convenient to fold them. Same with menus, right? When you have a choose from menu action that contains multiple nested actions, it would be nice to fold them and save vertical space so that browsing a shortcut vertically becomes easier and more responsive. Speaking of blocks, I would also love an expansion of a feature that Apple launched last year. In iOS 14, they added the ability to copy and paste actions in between shortcuts. And that is super convenient, and I've been using that feature a lot. However, it would be so much better if you could copy an entire block of actions and paste the whole block of multiple actions all at once in another shortcut. So once again, let me copy an if block, let me copy a menu, let me copy a repeat block, and paste all of the actions contained within that block elsewhere. I think that would save a lot of people like me, a lot of Shortcuts Power users, a lot of time. Also in the editor, I would love to see the ability to color code some actions. Just as a visual aid, again, when browsing a longer shortcut, I know that you can add comments before actions, and I do that a lot as a way to sort of comment my code, as developers and programmers would say. But I would also enjoy the visual aid of, make this action red, because the color red to me means, the action is not finished or something like that. This was a feature that editorial used to have years ago, be able to assign a color to an action so that it visually stands out. Speaking of colors, give me more colors for my shortcuts. I know that we have a choice of 12, 16, something colors, let me have either more colors or, here's a crazy idea, don't do any pre-built selection of colors. Just use the system color picker for colors. Let me choose any color I want, bring up the default grid for assigning colors to a shortcut. And if I want, let me pick whatever color I want to use for a shortcut instead of being limited to the default options.
And maybe open up more icons as well. There's a whole set of SF symbols out there. Why not have more of them?
Why not? And lastly, personally, when it comes to the app itself, I know that we just got folders, folder support for organizing your shortcuts, and that's great. But you know me, obviously, I'm going to ask for subfolders. Because, once you do folders, why not go the extra mile and also support subfolders? So that I could do things like a Mac Stories folder and then subfolders for shortcuts that belong to, say, writing or editing or publishing, right? I could have subfolders belonging to that master folder for, say, Mac Stories or Club Mac Stories, whatever. Once you do folders, you might as well also just do subfolders too.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good idea. I have a few here with the app as well. And one thing that I would like is a little bit easier way to browse actions, because when you have a lot of apps that are donating actions to shortcuts, it can, I shouldn't have to set up like a test shortcut just to kind of go through and scroll through and see what the actions are in there. I'd like to have a little bit more of like a catalog of actions that I can look through and get a better idea of what I might be able to build. I think debugging tools would be nice too. I'm not expecting like a full Xcode suite of tools here, but things like the ability to set breakpoints where you could, pause a shortcut as it's running and see what the state is of your variables and your inputs and outputs, so that you could debug issues a little easier. We do things like that are very, very primitive here, like using quick look a lot of times to output whatever happens to be at a particular stage, but that doesn't always work super well, and it's very limited in its utility. And then finally, I'd also like the ability to lock shortcuts. Like once I have a shortcut that works, that I don't need to mess around with, I'd like to lock it. So I just like you lock layers in Photoshop or something, so that I don't go into this shortcut and inadvertently drag something when I'm not paying attention with my finger, and then wonder what I did to mess up the shortcut. Lock it so that it's like that for forever, I guess.
That's a good idea. I like it.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Impending, who are now hiring an iOS engineer. Impending is a small team shipping apps straight into pop culture. They make Heads Up, the top iOS game 5 years in a row, where you try to guess a word on your forehead with clues from your friends. Heads Up has been played billions of times around the world and has generated an awful lot of laughter, and it's developed by a team of just 4 people at Impending. But they're looking for one more. They're looking to grow their team by hiring an iOS engineer. Maybe that could be you. It's a full-time salaried position with a solid work-life balance and flexible vacation scheduling. Plus, it's remote-friendly. If you think you might be right for this position, go to impending.com/hiring right now for more information. Again, go to impending.com/hiring right now to learn more about the remote-friendly iOS engineering opportunity at Impending, the maker of Heads Up. One more time, that's impending.com/hiring, or find a link in the show notes. Our thanks to Impending for their support of the show.
Let's talk actions. And here we have a very long list of stuff we would like to see. Obviously, it's been great that Apple opened up actions to third-party developers, but there's still some things that only Apple can do. And one of those things is, I'm going to start with the ability to create rich lists. So in iOS 14, Apple launched a new API for developers to offer actions that present rich lists of items in shortcuts. And by rich list, I mean lists that have subtitles, that have little thumbnails as preview images next to them. Basically, just more than a string of text. And developers have been taking advantage of this. Any buffer uses the API. Toolbox Pro uses the API. And I think it's time for Apple to offer its own rich list action. They can call it whatever they want to call it, but just the idea of allow me to put together manually lists of items that go beyond a single line of text, right? I want to have a subtitle. I want to have formatting. Right. I want to have a preview image of the document or photo I'm presenting in a list. I don't want to use third-party apps anymore for this. I don't want to use those workarounds like putting together contact cards to create rich lists.
Right.
I think this should be a native action with the native controls that you can expect from shortcuts and iOS. And speaking of UIs, I'm going to jump ahead in my notes, and I'm going to wish for, more broadly speaking, the ability to put together more complex UIs in shortcuts. Right now, you can, as I mentioned, present a list, or you can present an alert in the middle of the screen, or choose from a menu. And that's really about it. Like in terms of interfaces that you can create from shortcuts, that's all you can do. And I think maybe it's time to offer users the ability to create more complex, more involved interfaces. I'm thinking stuff like forms, right? With multiple options, multiple input options. Again, rich lists, or maybe, custom grids of items that you want to present. Maybe this could all be powered by Swift UI. And I'm not wishing for, obviously, writing Swift UI code in shortcuts. All of this should be done. I mean, John, you mentioned you don't want to steal elements from Xcode, but here I'm going to say they should maybe steal Interface Builder and have something super simplified, super simple, that allows me to put together a grid of items, or, again, a form with multiple input options, stuff like toggles and checkboxes and, multiple text fields, stuff like that. I think it's time for shortcuts to have that kind of maturity when it comes to custom UIs.
Yeah, I like that idea a lot of something like Interface Builder, especially on the iPad where you have room to actually expand that out and design the UI and how the data connects into it. With grids and things, yeah, it would be great to have what is essentially a collection view or a table view that you could build right inside your shortcut. That would go a long way to being able to display a long list of data.
Exactly. Yes. We mentioned this next item on an episode of App Stories recently. We're going to repeat it here for context. I love to be able to control iPad multitasking from shortcuts. So the idea of creating new spaces, creating new split view instances, open and close windows that belong to an app, recreate your favorite spaces. So basically the idea of using shortcuts as not just as an app launcher, but as a workspace launcher, right? A way to automate the opening and closing of windows, of split views. Just imagine if I had a shortcut, like a button on my home screen that said IA Writer and Safari. And when I tap that button, in a second, I would, the system would put together an IA Writer window on the left and a Safari window on the right with the exact layout that I want to use. And I didn't have to do anything with the drag and drop and, arranging windows manually. I think there's a lot of potential for shortcuts to gain that kind of integration for multitasking on iPadOS.
Yeah, and look, I'd like to take your wish even further and actually wish for being able to do that with specific documents and specific apps. Build up, maybe I have a document like, for instance, App Stories show notes that I create every single week. I would like the ability to have kind of an App Stories show notes space that I create that would open the text file on one side and Safari on the other, for instance.
Yeah, that's a very good idea. I like it. Moving on. Again, I wrote about this multiple times, mentioned it on App Stories, gonna repeat it again. Deeper integration with files. I think it's incredible that 7 years after the launch of Workflow, the app that used to be Workflow before it was acquired by Apple, the integration with the file system is still the same as 2014, which is Shortcuts can only access its own subfolder in iCloud Drive. All you can do, if you want to automate files, they have to be located in iCloud Drive/Shortcuts. And I would love to see a system that is more similar to what Toolbox Pro, for example, can do, where you can poke a hole in the sandbox and say, I want to be able to automate files located in this folder that belongs to, I don't know, IA Writer, or that belongs to, iCloud Drive /downloads. Just be able to access any file, any folder. Obviously, this has to be based on a user-based permission system. I don't know how that can be done, but third-party developers are doing it. And I think it's very surprising that Apple isn't. And if you were to go a step beyond this, you can imagine, we're going to mention this also in the context of automations later, but it would be fantastic to essentially build in shortcuts what can be done on the Mac with utilities like Hazel and folder actions, right? Do something when this change occurs in this particular folder. Like when I drop a PDF in this folder, run this shortcut. That's possible on the Mac. It could be possible on iOS and iPadOS, but shortcuts needs to have better integration with files first.
Yeah, it would be nice to have shortcuts actually embedded in the Files app in a way too. So it's something like the quick actions. The quick actions that you find in the Finder where you can do things like convert file types or apply a set of filters to an image, that kind of thing. File-specific shortcuts in the Files app where you need them because you're browsing through your files would be a great addition.
Yeah, that could be a new extension point for shortcuts. I really like that idea.
Right.
Safari actions. This is one of the things that people ask me every single time. I would love to be able to access data from open windows and open tabs in Safari.
Yes,
this has long been possible on the Mac with AppleScript. I just want to be able to see, hey, what are my open tabs? What are the URLs of those tabs? Their titles, maybe. Just give me a list of tabs and let me do something with them. I don't know, maybe be able to do things like give me the URL of the frontmost window and the current tab because I want to automate my bookmark saving or something like that. It's a very basic kind of a browser integration that has long been possible on macOS and that I think would be super convenient on iOS and iPadOS too. Imagine things like you open 20 tabs and you want to save all those links to a note. Now you don't have to run a shortcut one by one. You can just run a single shortcut once and it appends all of those URLs to a note in 2 seconds. Let's see. I also mentioned this one before. I'm not really sure whether Apple will ever do it or not, but I think for the context of wouldn't it be fascinating if, then I'm going to mention it. Wouldn't it be fascinating, John, if you could run Swift code or arbitrary JavaScript code in shortcuts? And I'm just imagining a very basic run code action that supports Swift and JavaScript, the two languages that Apple seems to officially approve on iOS. A JavaScript action already exists, but it's limited to running in the share sheet in Safari and Safari alone. And I think it would be interesting if you for some things that you cannot do visually with actions, and if you know what you're doing, if you're a programmer, you could say, you know what, I'm just going to run some code to do this because I know how to do it in code. I don't have an action for it. So I think as a stopgap action for those times when you want shortcuts to do something, but it cannot, you could just step in and say, okay, let me do this via code. And then all the other actions, I'm going to use the visual ones.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know another set of shortcuts that you suggested here in our notes are Apple Music ones. And, there are Apple Music shortcuts already.
Well, there are music actions.
That's true. That's a very good point. There are music actions. And there's obviously a lot more that could be done here, right? I mean, what are some of the ones you're thinking of?
Well, I'm thinking that right now the actions are limited to your music library. Instead, what I would like to see are Apple Music actions. So based on the Apple Music online API, so that you could search for the entire Apple Music catalog, right? Retrieve any album, any song, any playlist, anything. I mean, again, Toolbox Pro can do this. So it is possible. There's an API that Apple itself makes and maintains. But in addition to searching, also things like play music on a specific destination over the Apple Music API. Something similar to Spotify Connect, basically, where you can say, hey, play this song on this speaker, even though I'm not on the same Wi-Fi network, right? Something like that. But even just Right now, you cannot do things like love a song in Apple Music, or do anything more complex than what it is supported in your local music library. So all those Apple Music actions and those integrations and the ability to search the entire Apple Music catalog, even adding things from the Apple Music catalog to your personal library, right now you cannot do that. So I would love to see not just music actions, but Apple Music actions in shortcuts.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I want to step outside of shortcuts actions just a little bit and suggest something which is better integration with web APIs. And, we've got the ability to interact with web APIs already in shortcuts, but I consider it one of the power user features. It's not always super easy to do. And a lot of that depends on the API vendor and how easy it is to navigate their system of tokens and all those sorts of things. I would think it would be, especially with the no-code movement being such a big thing right now, if there were a program between Apple and third-party API vendors where the vendors could just fill out some forms, essentially, some web forms, and create like a one-button sign-up process that would generate the tokens that were necessary, save them in shortcuts, and populate some common actions in the Shortcuts app. Basically streamline the process of figuring out what in a particular web API would work well in Shortcuts, and allow the web API vendors to do that on their end and on their websites, giving them another reason to get people signed up for their APIs. All right, Federico, let's move on to automations, because this is an area that I've been playing around in lately. And it's very frustrating right now using home automations and personal automations because they're so limited in what can be done. Now, there are ways to kind of work around some of that at times, but I feel like there's just a lot more that could be done here. And for instance, I think my wishes are largely HomeKit related, in that I wish the entire HomeKit API were available, so that automations in apps like Home Plus were not necessary, that you could access all of those details that app accesses right inside the Home app or through shortcuts using home automations. Plus, there are a bunch of things that really, I think, could stand being extended to be included in HomeKit and what can be automated. Things like the Apple TV. You can't, for instance, figure out what the state of an Apple TV is. I saw Quinn Nelson not long ago trying to figure this out on Twitter, and unfortunately, you just can't. He ended up relying on his HomeKit television because he could tell whether the television was on or not, but you can't do that with an Apple TV, which strikes me as really weird, because knowing that your Apple TV is turned on would be a great trigger for all sorts of automations for scenes of dimming your lights, closing your shades, whatever it happens to be, and you can't do that right now. So I'd like to see that. I think the personal automation stuff is great, but I think that it needs to be a little more flexible. I understand that there are concerns here probably with things happening without people realizing that they're happening, but I'd like to be able to set things off on a schedule, maybe tie things into the calendar app the way Automator can on the Mac, where you can fire off Automator actions and workflows right inside the calendar app with an alert. That would be great. It's an area that I feel like is in its own separate tab in Shortcuts, in large part because it's so much more limited than the main shortcut section of the app. And I would like to see it become more of a full-fledged thing within Shortcuts.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I like those ideas. When it comes to automations, which I do not use a lot, but if I think I would find use cases for them with more types of triggers. And some triggers that I thought of, proximity. I think it would be fascinating if all the proximity-based stuff that Apple has been doing lately, especially with the U1 chip, it would be fun if you could tie, bringing an iPhone close to a HomePod Mini or maybe to another iPhone could trigger an automation and run some actions on via shortcuts. And similarly, I've long thought that it would be cool to have this idea of people-based proximity. I would love to do something like the next time I'm meeting with this person, do remind me about this, basically. And I don't know how technically feasible this is. Obviously, you would have to authorize a contact, and shortcuts would have, how is that even possible? Via location, via the other person's iPhone? What does proximity even mean? But I just feel like proximity for other devices, yes, I would like it. But proximity based on contacts, like the next time I see John, run a shortcut that does this. I don't know. I just think it would be interesting. But even more, what I would love is, again, I mentioned this in the iOS 14 review, triggers based on third-party apps. So let me run an automation when something happens in a third-party app that has set up a trigger for those specific conditions. So whether I, do something when I publish an article from Ulysses, or do something when I like a tweet in the Twitter app. So conditions defined by third-party developers that become triggers for personal automations in shortcuts.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I like your proximity one a lot too. I think I would couple proximity with presence, because an awful lot of, especially when you're dealing with things like HomeKit, there's no concept of presence. There's only the concept of who's in a location, so that you can do things like when the last person leaves your house or the first person arrives, you can use those things as triggers. But you can't, it's harder when, say you have two people in your home and one of them's in one room and the other's in the other room. You don't really have the ability to kind of fine tune your automations based on what room a particular person is in, which could be really interesting and open up a lot of opportunities.
Okay. Lastly, just a quick rundown of some system integrations that we would like to see tweaked and improved in shortcuts in the future. I'm going to start with the widget. I mentioned again before that I don't really like the current layout options of the shortcuts widget. I would love to see more information density. I would love to see not just 4, but 8 shortcuts in the medium-sized widgets. So basically double the number of shortcuts available in the medium-sized widget on the home screen. I also wonder if in the future of iOS 15, maybe the small size widget could also support multiple touch targets instead of just one. Because I would love to have 4 icon-sized shortcuts inside the small tile of a small widget instead of just one shortcut. But I also wonder if maybe in the future of shortcuts, I think it would be fun to consider the idea of what if you could create your own widget from shortcuts? Imagine, and I think some third-party developers have explored this idea of custom widgets with data being populated by an automation that runs in shortcuts. So imagine and again, this goes back to the idea that automation needs to be expanded. And now that I think about it, I forgot to mention this. I would love to see better, more options for running shortcuts every X minutes, for example. Right now, you can set a schedule. But what I really like to do is an automation that says every 5 minutes, do this without confirmation, right? And if that became possible, I think it would be fun to imagine this sort of a design your own widget feature where you have a widget and the data that you see in the widget is populated by a shortcut. So whether it's, put together a list of my events and my reminders, or show me the latest files from my Dropbox account, anything, right? Imagine if that data came from an automation, and if that widget, you design your own widget effectively, and the data that you see in there comes from a shortcut.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I guess I would kind of add on to that. And one thing I was thinking about is, what if you could embed shortcuts right in widgets? So say you had a DoorDash widget that told you that you had a delivery coming in 10 minutes. And that meant, you want to switch over to your front door camera and turn on the lights. And, maybe you have a few other things you want to have happen as that person approaches your house. you could have that shortcut embedded right inside the widget. And I think that's it goes to two things. One is it goes to the difficulty you've been having with widgets themselves not being interactive, because it would make them interactive. And two, it would allow you to add functionality to existing widgets that don't offer their own sort of functionality. Now, I mean, obviously there's all sorts of UI issues potentially with figuring out how you could embed your shortcut in someone else's widget. But I think it would be really interesting if you could have that glanceable information that you want, but then be able to define yourself what happens once you see, something has happened.
Yeah, I like it. Okay, what else do we have left here? Siri. So obviously you can run shortcuts with Siri. You have been able to do this for the past couple of years. But what you cannot do is you cannot pass any input via your voice to the shortcut when you trigger it via Siri. So right now you can just say the trigger phrase and the shortcut runs. But what I would like to do is pass on some input text, basically. So imagine if I said, hey, assistant, something like run weather forecast with Rome, Italy. And that last part of the sentence, with Rome, Italy, means use Rome, Italy as input text for this shortcut. So Siri says, run this shortcut and use Rome, Italy as input, which means check the weather for this city in the world. So the idea of not just triggering shortcuts via Siri, but triggering them and also passing on some input that the shortcut can understand and act upon.
Yeah, that's a fantastic idea. And that's I think the kind of thing that I could definitely see being added, because it's building on what is already there in terms of the voice recognition and passing text around. So, yeah, that would be a great one.
And two final things before we wrap up the episode. On the Apple Watch, I think it's great that Apple brought back shortcuts to the Apple Watch, but I would really like the complications that you can set for a shortcut on the watch to run a shortcut directly without taking me to the Shortcuts app on the watch and having to confirm every single time, run this shortcut. I just want to press a button on my watch face and the shortcut runs. Just the whole flow of it is too slow, at least for it to be useful to me on the watch. And lastly, this has to be one of the most popular feature requests. Let me set a system-wide keyboard shortcut to run my shortcuts on the iPad from anywhere. Let me set system-wide hotkeys for running shortcuts, and I'll be happy.
Yeah, that would be amazing. I mean, it's so powerful to be able to do that on the Mac, and frustrating that you can't do it on iOS. So I'm right there with you on that one. All right, Federico. Well, we've given the shortcuts team a lot to do. Do you think they can get it done by June?
Sure.
All right. Well, we don't have to do it.
I'm optimistic.
You've got your assignments, people.
Just get to work.
Get to work. We want to see results in June. All right, Federico. I want to thank our two sponsors again for this episode. That is Fitbod and Impending. Of course, you can find me and Federico over at macstories.net. Federico is on Twitter and Instagram, where he is at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHWES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.